Returning to Venezuela now and a deeper dive into the coverage with the help of a journalist who knows Latin America. This has been such a topsy-turvy story with conflicting narratives and justifications coming out of the White House day after day. And while the administration has been flooding the zone with news material that the media have picked up on, the reporting coming out of Venezuela about the people affected has come up short, both in terms of volume and the kind of content that we've been seeing. To help us make sense of it all, if such a thing is possible, we are joined by Jose Luis Granados Ceja of Dropsite News. He heads up their Latin America desk from Mexico City. You've covered Latin America. You know about America's habit of meddling in that part of the world, so you're familiar with the history, the kind of news coverage that comes out of the U.S. at times like this. Has anything jumped out at you over this past week, the media output, the kind of terminology that's been used to describe this story?
You know, it's been really surprising to see how certain media outlets have been reluctant to describe what actually happened. And I think we all saw what happened that early morning on Saturday. It was a kidnapping. It was the United States using its military might to invade a country, to massacre a lot of people, Venezuelans, Cubans, in order to kidnap a president because that president was too inconvenient for their foreign policy. And then the rush to try to make it about resources. And of course, we have to remember, Venezuela is a country that since the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998 has been undergoing a revolution that was basically centered on the need to use the country's oil wealth for the benefit of the population. I think this is a really important watershed moment for the region, arguably for the entire world, about the kind of world we do live in, about how there seems to be an insistence now that might makes right. This brazen act should have rung all of the alarm bells. You know, some of the early statements were really quite weak.
Even if an arrest violates some of the principles or tenets of international law, it doesn't mean that the case gets dismissed.
Obviously, there are question marks about legality and what comes next, but as a military operation, it was very effective.
I think really the lack of forceful condemnation is opening the door to a kind of future that I'm worried about, that I think makes everybody less safe.
When looking at the coverage of Venezuela itself, there's been a lot said about Maduro's rule, the mismanagement, the repression, economic situation. What has struck you as some of the most reductive or particularly outrageous lines in that narrative? And what in the context here has gone missing?
So, of course, we have to talk about the fact that, you know, the war by the U.S. against Venezuela didn't start this week. It started at the beginning of the century, quite literally, when in 2002 there was a U.S.-backed coup against Hugo Chavez that actually briefly ousted him from power. This has been a very long campaign. We have seen so many efforts at regime change in Venezuela, driven by international actors, principally the United States. I mean, it's just action after action after action that got us here. You know, a lot of people talk about the political realities or questioning the results of the 2024 election. And I always say, you know, you can't talk about free and fair elections when you have the world's most powerful country pointing its guns at you the way that the United States has. And all of that has been missing. There's always been the caricature of Maduro as kind of the brutal despot and the dictator and you know, rules by repression. And there's one thing that I would say here that I would really highlight is that there's never an effort to really get to the grassroots. You know, there are millions of revolutionaries, grassroots organizers in Venezuela who deeply believe in their project, who want to put their little bit of effort into the construction of a different style of economy. Yes, socialism is still on the agenda in Venezuela. The communards marching in Caracas, calling for the return of Nicolás Maduro and Cilia Flores, and doing so on that basis, saying we are communards, we run our territories, we decide what happens, we are constructing something new here in Venezuela. And there's never really any airtime for them when they are some of the most extraordinarily committed people in that country. And they are the ones that I would put at the forefront when we talk about Venezuela, because they're really the motors of everything that has been happening in that country in a positive sense.
You've made a strong argument for the support that Maduro has and had in Venezuela, but to be clear, there was repression under his rule, including of the press, journalists at times. Was what he did on that score defensible?
I think when we think about Venezuelan politics, we should think about it as being extraordinary on a daily basis, in the sense that there are sometimes extraordinary measures like these to try to control dissent in critical moments because of the history of the country, because there have been coup attempts, because there have been sabotage attempts. These have always been ridiculed as to say that, oh no, the US is never going to do that. You know, they couldn't possibly conceive of it. And yet it did happen. And so that, I think, helps us understand why you do see, essentially, yes, the heavy hand of the state to try to preserve the political unity of the country. Now, obviously, there have been cases of abuse, and that is where it's important to actually defend Venezuela's institutions, to say these institutions need to jump in and actually hold these bad actors accountable. Because there are, of course, like in any country, there are people who exceed their functions, or non-state actors who also break the law. There cannot be impunity. Nothing justifies impunity. A message has to be sent that when crimes are committed, they should be punished.
Prior to this past week, few people outside of Venezuela had ever heard the name Delcy Rodriguez. The assumption was that if Trump took power away from Maduro, he would end up handing it to Maria Corina Machado, the opposition figure. Instead, it's Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president. So what do we need to know about Delcy Rodriguez, her CV, and what is it about her that the Americans like?
You know, she's actually quite an interesting figure. Her father was a organizer, a communist, and was killed by the state. And that forced her to have to reckon with how to interact with a world that is willing to kill your family members because of their political convictions. And so she decided to actually go into law and became a labor lawyer, actually. She studied in Paris. She speaks English. She speaks French. She was always kind of you think of her as like a loyal organizer, soldier of the Bolivarian Revolution. Always someone who was, you know, high profile because of her talents. There were some documents there, apparently, from the CIA where even they admit that they felt that they could work better with her, interestingly enough. And so, obviously, she's someone who finds herself in an extraordinary position. And I think the challenge before her now is to use her skills to maintain unity in the country. Really, this is the key question, I think, facing Venezuela right now. This is an unstable moment. As you well said, Maria Corina Machado, who looked like they were trying to position her, doesn't appear to be poised to take over, and I don't think is actually in a position to even try in this moment. You know, of course, she doesn't find herself in the country, but also, even if she did, Trump said as much, admitting that she doesn't have the actual capacity to lead the country.
Well, I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within or the respect within the country.
You know who does? In my estimation, it is Delcy Rodriguez, to try to keep the country together in this really critical time. And of course, you know, rallying all of those different forces around her inside the country.
Do you buy the Nobel Peace Prize angle that Trump's resentment of the awarding of the Peace Prize to Machado instead of to him had anything to do with Washington's decision to go with Rodriguez? And have we ever seen a story like this, Jose Luis, where jealousy may have affected this kind of policy decision?
You know, with Trump, you never know. He denies it, apparently. In a report, he said, no, that had nothing to do with it. But he is a man who's very much driven by ego, and I can't help but think that he did take a personal offense that someone other than him won the Peace Prize. But no, I don't think that actually was the primary motivation. They're interested in the resources. And that's why we've heard from them over and over and over again. So this is about US dominance over Latin America. And so for them, it's actually more convenient to not have the instability of regime change, of putting someone like Maria Corina Machado into power, because she would preside over an incredibly unstable situation.
We're going to leave it there. Jose Luis Granados Ceja of Dropsite News, thank you so much for speaking with us here at The Listening Post today.
Thank you much for inviting me.